Okay, well, thanks very much, and thanks for the introduction. And it's great to be here with all of you. And I hope what I have to say will be helpful. I've obviously spoken with Karen and others about what she felt would be helpful, so we'll see how we go with that. So what I'm going to do is start by just defining the concept of transitional justice, or how it's at least seen globally. I'm also going to raise some challenges around the concept and where it overlaps with other things and where it doesn't overlap, and how it's sort of changed over the last while. I was specifically asked to look at that, so I'll start with the issue of transitional justice. I'm then going to just talk a bit about where it then overlaps with education. And that's quite a tricky thing, because actually there aren't any big, splendid, wonderful examples that I can really point you to, but I can tell you about what's said in the field, what's been focused on, and what's being talked about. And so that'll be the second part of the talk. And then I thought what I would do is just end by raising a couple of challenges, some of the issues that I think are underlying some of the debates between transitional justice and education. So that's what we're going to try and focus on. I think if I push this, something happens. Yes, okay. So I thought I would sort of start there, because I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk. And in a sense, this is a mantra that you hear very much within the transitional justice field. Those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And wherever you go in the transitional justice world, you will hear this. Whether you're looking at museums, whether you're looking at Truth Commission reports, many of them have taken the title "Never Again," "Nunca Más," don't repeat the past. We have to learn. If we uncover what's happened, things will be different in the future. And this is very much at the heart of some of the thinking of transitional justice. And I wanted us to just start here and come back to that at the end, because to some degree I want to agree with that, and to some degree I also want to raise some of the challenges around that statement. I was also thinking of printing those t-shirts, but I don't think I'll make my fortune from necessarily selling them, either here or in South Africa, for that matter. Let's see, there we go. So what is transitional justice? I've put a little bit of verbiage on the PowerPoints, because I thought at least you can take them away, so I won't go through every single piece of it. But the field of transitional justice itself is actually a relatively new field. Now, there's debates in the field about how new and how old. So there are some people who are saying, well, if you read the Iliad, that's all about reconciliation, and transitional justice as a field has actually been there forever. And others who are saying, no, it's a new, more contemporary, modernist type of a thing that has developed. So there is a little bit of a debate about how long has this debate been around. And I do think to some degree the issue of how do societies deal with a legacy, particularly of political violence, has been around for centuries. It is something which has confronted communities and societies all over the place. But what we've seen really since the mid-80s onwards is the development of this field that has become known as transitional justice. And specifically, it's a field which is about responses to systematic or widespread violations of human rights. I tend to come a little bit of it slightly wider, so I often just talk to it about how do societies deal with the legacy of political violence. That's normally the frame that I use, but more officially people would say it's the response and the response to systematic or widespread human rights violation. How do societies deal with that? Now, certainly in the beginning part of this field, it was very much associated with law. So it was really looking at what are the legal responses, what are the legal mechanisms that a society might need to be put in place. And what I'm going to go on to say is to say that's actually become a lot wider. But it started very much within the legal field. It was to be grounded within the idea of international law. What were the standards that a society should be putting in place if it's dealing with a legacy of political violence? To some degree, that has continued. In a large degree, it has. The UN now has a set of principles around transitional justice. It has principles around reparations. So it has started to take on some international shape. If you look at the history of it, it does throughout talk about what's key to transitional justice is the recognition of victims. Now, I think it's a debate to what degree are victims always the center of transitional justice processes, because I think it's been different in different places. And as I'll go on to say, often for societies emerging from conflict, dealing with the legacy of political violence, there's this complicated balance between the needs of victims and the needs of society and the needs of peace. So you'll see the three words I've used there, peace, justice, reconciliation, and democracy. And actually, quite often, these are not such good bedfellows. So, in principle, if you read the UN statement about it, it'll say, you know, it's essential that justice and democracy are essential to peace. And that's why transitional justice is important. But then we say, well, what does justice mean? What does justice mean in Rwanda when you have 100,000 people sitting in jail awaiting trial? What does that mean? We're going to start prosecuting them for the next 200 years, and that's going to take us to peace, or is there another way that we might have to approach that? So they're really complicated questions between these easy words that we can link together, like peace and justice and democracy and reconciliation. Typically, however, in this field, largely from a legal perspective, when people say transitional justice, they're meaning a whole lot of different mechanisms. And some of those, for example, might be prosecutions, or they might be truth commissions. They could be commissions of inquiry, where a difference, broadly speaking, between a truth commission and an inquiry would focus on one event, whereas a truth commission might focus on a period of history, so it's a wider type of a process. That word lustrations is there because in the early days of transitional justice, it was very much one of the tools which was seen at the front of it. And what they mean by lustration is that people might be removed from office as part of the process. Now, we saw that in Iraq recently. But as I'll go on to say, a lot of this history came out of the move of the Soviet states from dictatorship, or however you want to call it, to some form of democracy. So the idea of what they call vetting or lustration became a key tool within that, people who were in the Communist Party or other types of political groups. More recently, the field has also developed into what it talks about security sector reform, and what they mean by that is generally reform of the policing and military institutions, so that the change, if the violations were linked with those type of institutions, reforming those might also be part of your mechanisms that you might use as you move out of conflict. And then even more recently, people have started to talk about memorials, museums, victim services as part of this field as well. So it started to get slightly bigger. I think in the beginning people were probably thinking of trials, prosecutions, and it's sort of grown. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The International Center for Transitional Justice, which is based in New York, it talks about transitional justice not as a form of special justice. So it says that it's really justice applied within a certain type of a context, is what they would say. Now again, this is a big debate in the field. Is this a unique form of justice? Or is this just justice that's tailored towards a specific type of a context? And you can see how that can also become a bit of a circular argument in and of itself. As I said to you, originally where this field emerged from was through societies which were moving from dictatorship to some form of democracy. Two main trends there, the Soviet Union and within Latin America, Chile, Argentina. And that's really where the field started to emerge. And we saw in Latin America them starting to use the idea of truth commissions, which was collecting large amounts of testimony from victims to paint a picture of the past. And in the Soviet Union, a slightly different process where they were trying to come to terms with a series of violations, but maybe using more things like trials or sometimes using lustrations and vetting. So slightly, I'm being very general, but slightly different types of processes start to emerge and they shape the field. Now, I think what's interesting about the field is that nowadays it's being applied to all sorts of contexts. So if I said to you how many truth commissions there have been in the world, what would your guess be? Big, small? Small, right. So there have been like over 40 truth commissions. So it's been used in all sorts of different countries. And one of the criticisms might be that it's now becoming a bit standardized. There's a sort of expectation that you should go through certain types of mechanisms rather than others. But what we've also seen is these type of mechanisms now being discussed in societies which are not moving from authoritarian rule to democratic rule, but it's been used, for example, in Morocco. So Morocco had a truth commission where, in a sense, it was moving from not so liberal, I don't know what the right word is, not so liberal, what is the word I'm looking for? Kingdom.
It's sort of like an authoritarian kingdom.
Yeah, so from a like semi-authoritarian kingdom to not such an authoritarian kingdom. You know, so they're using the mechanisms in those type of processes. So essentially talking about moving from not so democratic to a bit more democratic. And that is interesting because depending on how you cut the problem, you could argue, well, where does Northern Ireland fall into? It doesn't really fall into a debate between a dictatorship. Some people might argue that, but I mean, just objectively, it wasn't really a dictatorship to a free, open democracy. It's sort of something in between. It's why maybe South Africa a little bit easier to think about, because it's a much clearer sense of a very authoritarian state to a different type of a government. So those are some of the debates which are taking place. Someone probably should time me here and tell me, because I'm probably going to go way over here. So, as I said, it also started particularly focused on legal mechanisms. So the other trend we've now started to see is it moving much more towards what one could call social utility. So it's not just about, are we doing justice? Now people are saying, well, what is the outcome of that? Is it building relationships? Is it creating reconciliation? So the idea of, and there's still a lot of legal people in the transitional justice field who I think now wish they could roll it back to where it's just about justice, as if justice is something that you do and it's not really linked to the social context. But I think you can't really escape that anymore. People will ask those questions. And even if you look at something like the International Criminal Court, which started out very much as just prosecuting people, if you go through their newsletters, you'll now see they use the word reconciliation occasionally. This is not just about prosecuting baddies. This is about reconstructing society, building reconciliation, rebuilding relationships. So the social aspect of what's happening has now become a reality of the field, and I don't think we can necessarily escape it. So Ruti Taitel, who's written one of the earlier books in transitional justice, says now they've become transitional justice become associated with a diverse set of nation-building projects, and that's also an interesting language, because one of the debates in South Africa is, was the Truth Commission about uncovering the truth, giving victims space, or was it a mechanism to build a new nation, which is a different sort of a debate, probably somewhere in between, but these are some of the debates. In terms of the impact and evaluation, and I've been very general here, I haven't talked about specific processes, there is still a gap in the field. How do we know these things are working is a very difficult question, although some evidence is now starting to emerge, and what it's generally saying, which is not rocket science, which is that actually if a society takes on multiple mechanisms, it tends to do better than those that try to take on one mechanism. So if you just said, we're going to forget about the past and have amnesty, there tends to be a better outcome, even if you had an amnesty, but with a partial justice process, with some sort of truth recovery process, with some sort of compensation for victims. So there is starting to emerge some data which starts to suggest that if you have a mixture of mechanisms, this would work. And increasingly, this is the reality we're seeing in this field. So if you look at somewhere like Sierra Leone, what Sierra Leone did was it had a special court which prosecuted people who were responsible for war crimes. It had a truth commission where victims could come forward and tell their stories, as well as what one might call lower level perpetrators, if that makes any sense. And it's also engaged in a whole lot of community reconciliation processes, various ritual type activities. And increasingly people are now talking about this as a hybrid approach, that you're needing multiple mechanisms. And I think if you think of Northern Ireland, that sort of makes sense. Actually, depending on how you want to look at it, this society is already engaging in a whole lot of different mechanisms, from community work through to ad hoc apologies, through to some forms of compensation, through to things like the HET, occasionally prosecution. The question is, what's the best way to put that combination together? And some would argue that the sort of everything's going is not as useful as trying to maybe put it into one type of a structure. And if we look at consistently, Eames Bradley, the Haas documents, they're all moving in the same way. They're all saying multiple things, but try and put it together. Now, whether that's right or wrong, we can debate that, but that seems to be the trajectory of what's actually going on. Finally, what we've also started to see with the transitional justice field is it's now starting to look at wider issues. So it's starting to say, oh, well, how does these mechanisms relate to identity issues? So now there's like books about transitional justice and identity. How does it relate to peace-building issues? How does it relate to development or socioeconomic? How does it relate to children? How does it relate to education? So the field is starting to spread. If I was critical, the one thing I would say about it is that one of the dangers is that what's now happening is a little bit of a circular argument where slowly those who started from a very legal perspective in transitional justice are now discovering peace building. And those who are in the peace building field have slowly started to discover that there are these sort of legal, overarching, big collective mechanisms. And maybe somewhere they'll meet in the middle. But as it happens, in the way these fields often develop, they sort of develop as exclusive things, but maybe their goals are not really that different.